Hello, everyone. Welcome back for the second. We're going to do units 3 and 4 today. Excuse me, just like last time, if you want to leave questions in the comments, then I'll answer those as I kind of get around to it. And then I'll have some time at the end if you have any questions as well. So we're going to start. Unit 3 is 1800 to 1840. I still have not figured out or downloaded the software I need to show both at the same time, so I'll go this way. So we're going to start with Thomas Jefferson. There's the rundown that I have for Jefferson. Some significant things to think about as you look at Jefferson's presidency is keep in mind his hypocrisy. Also keep in mind that he's the first transition of power for the president. So before it was the Federalists, George Washington was kind of a Federalist, and then John Adams is also a Federalist, and then Thomas Jefferson is going to be a Democratic Republican. And so for the first time, we really see this transition, and it is a peaceful one. The election's kind of close, and on inauguration, no one shoots each other. They just let the next party be president. And so that's a significant moment in American history. Also, remember that Thomas Jefferson, as a Democratic Republican, believes in the state power. He wants to make the federal government smaller, and he doesn't necessarily always do that. So keep his hypocrisy in mind as well. One of the significant things he'll do in his first term is he's going to find ways to decrease the power of the federal government. So you're going to see him cutting the size of the army. You're going to see him getting rid of the Bank of the United States. You're going to see him literally making the government smaller. He'll get rid of taxes like the whiskey tax, which led to the Whiskey Rebellion. And so he's going to be doing all these things which align with his beliefs. So that's not hypocrisy. However, the big example that shows his hypocrisy is going to be the Louisiana Purchase. He's really worried about access to the Mississippi River. That all funnels through New Orleans, and we did not own New Orleans. It's Spain's, then it goes to France. And so we contact the French and we say, hey, we'd love to buy New Orleans from you. And Napoleon responds with, do you want it all? He's trying to take over all of Europe and the world, and so he's perfectly fine with selling this land and getting that money and turning it into victories, which don't work out well for him. But we go, yeah, heck yeah, let's do this. And there's one problem, and the problem is technically the Constitution doesn't say we can do this, and that goes against Jefferson and his beliefs. His beliefs are in strict interpretation. We're only going to do what the Constitution says, and I mean, that's it. But now, and we see that in the Bank of the United States. That's exactly what he says to Hamilton. But now it's his idea, and he wants it, and he thinks it's better for people. And so he goes, let's do it. And so we are going to move forward with Louisiana Purchase. Lewis and Clark will go out, Sacagawea, the whole 9 yards, all of that. But it doubles the size of America overnight. It is a significant impact on the country. Midnight Judges is an important moment. That's the one I have next here. The Midnight Judges are basically when Adams is trying to stack the judicial system with all these Federalist judges, and Jefferson goes about to limit those letters from being delivered, and there's lawsuits over it, and really all we care about is judicial review in the case of Marbury versus Madison, where the Supreme Court says we can declare laws unconstitutional. That's the significant part for that. In speaking of that court, that is the Marshall Court. Track the Marshall Court throughout time and notice how they're going to be either giving power to the federal government or protecting the rights of the people. So they're going to be taking away power from the states. I mentioned this last time, and I'll mention it throughout the rest of these. Watch in American history as we go from we should not have the federal government be in power to the federal government should be in power. We do this dramatic shift over the course of American history. Here's one of those first steps where we're seeing the Supreme Court start chipping away at states' rights or the powers of the states. Britain and France is going to start, being upset at each other, and that'll end up. That's been kind of going on for a while. It happened under George Washington, and he said neutrality. We're not going to get involved. It happened under John Adams, and we had the XYZ affair, Alien Sedition Act, all of those. Well, it's still going on. You have that impressment happening, and it comes to a head so much that Jefferson's response is the Embargo Act. And so the Embargo Act is we are not going to trade with England or France. So we ban our own merchants from doing that, which is a terrible economic idea. It's a disaster. And it really goes against the idea of Jefferson having that the government shouldn't be restricting people's liberty and freedom. So a little hypocrisy there. And Americans hate it. Like, it's a disaster. It hurts our economy. People smuggle, and then he's got to increase the size of the army to stop the smuggling, and that also goes against his beliefs. And in my class, if you were part of this, I showed you an excerpt from a newspaper, and in it they told the story. And I mean, they pretended it was real. One of the newspaper people runs off to the west, and he's like, stops an old farmer, and he's like, "Hey, what are your thoughts on the Embargo Act?" And the guy's like, "Oh, well, you people in the East, I'm sure you know. I'm just going to tell you a story." And he tells this story about a man who had a horse, and the horse runs away, and the man's like boy or helping hand who was there runs after into the woods to chase it down, and then just like doesn't come back. And so the man goes in the woods, and he's trying to look for the boy, and like, it's like, okay, where is he? And he finds the boy standing in like an open field, staring down at a hole in the ground. And he asked the boy, like, "What are you doing?" And the boy said, "I saw a groundhog run in there, and I'm waiting him out. I'm going to starve him out. But boy, am I hungry." And then that's the scene. And the idea is, it's really ironic that America's like, we're going to make Britain and France care about us because we're going to take away a way they could make money. And in doing so, we only hurt ourselves. We don't actually hurt them. And so, yeah, the embargo is a disaster. And so Jefferson obviously doesn't run for a third term, and that's not a great situation. This will lead us into the War of 1812, when we figure out, oh, I guess maybe the Embargo Act doesn't work. You're going to see, excuse me, some of the causes are really long forming. One of it's, I mean, we don't really care for Britain that much. Another one is what I mentioned with the impressment and the kidnapping of our sailors. And we're upset that we as a nation aren't able to trade the way we want to. And so there's a slogan that these war hawks, these Western congressmen, for the most part, who are, calling out, "We should fight them, we should fight them." It's free trade and sailors' rights. So we should be able to trade. We're an independent country. And there was an honor component attached to that. Like, no, we're a big deal. We're an important country. You can't tell us what to do. Because we are the adolescents on the scene, and that, the kid who thinks they're probably more than they are, and they have to puff out their chest to act all strong. That's kind of what America's doing on the grand stage. And so we want to fight to protect this honor. And so we will fight the War of 1812. There's a great College Humor video on this, if you search it in YouTube, that is a pretend movie trailer for it. And they're like, people don't really know about the War of 1812. But in doing that, they point out, yeah, the War of 1812 is kind of weird. Like, we fight everywhere. We get the national anthem out of it at the Battle of Baltimore. We have the White House burned and destroyed. It's a bad look for us. And then we, fight for a few years. And then at the Treaty of Ghent, Britain's like, "Do you want to stop?" And we go, "Yeah." And so we just fight for this period of time, and then we stop, and nothing changes. There was no point. Now, I do want to point out, though, an interesting little timeline situation with the War of 1812. The treaty again signed in Belgium, and it takes a while to come over. And someone's signed, taking his time. And Andrew Jackson, general in New Orleans, leads this massive assault. The Americans have this really significant victory, and people hear about that before because it's faster. And so what they hear is, "Oh, we won the Battle of New Orleans," and then they hear, "Oh, a treaty was signed, the war's over," and we go, "Oh, we won!" And everyone is like really proud of America. They're like, "We did it." No, it was a tie. Technically, also, we lost the White House, but we won. Yay. And it ushers in the era of good feelings. And you're going to have all of this like positive energy coming about. That'll bring us into Monroe, who will be the president after Madison. And for the era of good feelings, we have one political party. During the War of 1812, the Federalists at the Hartford Convention are like, "What if we seceded and like didn't do this?" And everyone was like, "You guys are traitors." And they're like, "Well, I mean, no." And then the Federalist name is done, and it's replaced by the Democratic Republicans, and they're kind of the one party. So we have one party. We're super happy. The economy is doing great. That's a significant thing to know for this time period. It's the market revolution. You have kind of three regional economies. I always forget I'm flipped in here, so sorry if the West isn't where it's supposed to be. You have the North, which is going to be that industry focus. A lot of it's going to be textiles. Shout out to Samuel Slater for stealing the plans and bringing them over. That's going to happen in New England because you have the access to the little rivers that enable you to have water power for this. The South obviously is going to be focused on cash crops, but we're going to see a switch. We're going from tobacco to cotton, and that's because of the invention of the cotton gin by Eli Whitney. And so all of a sudden, it's lucrative to grow cotton. And this also is going to lead to an increase in slaves because you need a lot of labor for cotton. And now that we're making money off of it, why wouldn't we want slaves? And so you're going to see the slave numbers increase. You're going to see slavery start spreading as people start accessing land. That's going to be important to keep in mind because this whole review today is going to go all the way up through Reconstruction. And so we're going to track how does this economic desire for, well, money, but specifically in the South, cotton, how is that going to lead to a spread of slavery, and how is that going to lead to the eventual Civil War? So that's what the South's focusing on. And then the West, which for me is here, and I think for you guys is here. The West is going to focus on, food, livestock. They're known as the breadbasket of America. And so they're going to be feeding all of the other groups. And you're going to see things like the American System by Henry Clay. Shout out to Henry Clay, who's going to be mentioned a few other times throughout this. The American System is going to focus on another Bank of the United States because Jefferson killed it. We need protective tariffs to protect American manufacturing, and we need to increase the linkage with the transportation options. So you're going to see roads, canals, railroads, early railroads, and then you're going to see steamboats, things like that. I do want to point out a lot of that navigational advancement, especially railroads, is primarily happening in the North, and that'll pay dividends for them down the line. Whereas the West is going to lean very heavily on steamboats and the Mississippi River. And the South is going to use rivers out to the ocean, which is going to be a problem for them kind of long term. We have the Monroe Doctrine. Before we get into this whole expansion thing, you have the Monroe Doctrine, which is basically Europe. You stay on your side of the world, we'll stay on our side, and never the twain shall meet. I really don't want to just, you stay away, we'll stay away. We're not going to get involved. And that's kind of a new step for America. We have this veiled threat of oh, well, we'll get you if you come over, but nothing really comes of that. But America's going to follow this for arguably we'll dabble a little bit in World War I, and then we quickly retreat back. We're oh, no. And then really it's World War II when we start being a world power. Shout out to those of you who went to the writing review session yesterday. We looked at this a little bit in the idea of the Monroe Doctrine being reflected, in Manifest Destiny and imperialism and things like that as well. So you have that. And then we have our first taste at, hey, do you think it's a problem, this whole slave and free thing? Missouri becomes a state. Well, they apply for statehood and they say, hi, we're Missouri, we want to be a slave state. And it's a problem. We have a perfect balance going on between free and slave states. And if Missouri comes in as a slave state, it'll tip that balance. And, the balance isn't in the House of Representatives because you can't make sure population is equal. But you can in the Senate because every state gets 2 senators and you can keep that number equal. So the number's equal. And Missouri would throw that off. And so Henry Clay, again, I mentioned him, he's going to step in and he's going to go, all right, here's the deal. We make Missouri a slave state, whoop, throws the balance off. But we break Maine away from Massachusetts. We make it its own state. That's a free state. That'll equal the balance back out. And then to solve future problems, they come up with the 3630 line. We are going to draw a line from, excuse me, we're going to draw a line from, basically it's right under Missouri, right to the end of the Louisiana Purchase. Anything north of that, any land that comes in, they're going to come into the free state. Anything below is going to be a slave state. I don't have the map in front of you, so just imagine in your mind. But the thing that I always point out here is we know we're going to get California. And California runs all the way down that line. And so there is going to be the problem of once the line hits, oh crap, what do we do about California? Not to mention there's the question of, can the line even go that far? What do we do if we add other land? And then also the fact that there's way more territory in the northern part than there is the southern part. That's not fair. That's going to throw off our boundary or our balance. But nope, everyone's like, we solved it. We never have to worry about this again. That's not really what happened. I do want to point out a couple things from a social front real quick before I move on. You are going to see a division of labor, and this is going to introduce the cult of domesticity. So I name dropped this last time, and I also mentioned Republican motherhood. Republican motherhood is primarily what's going on before this, and Republican motherhood is women need to be educated so they can educate their sons, so their sons can be educated in, you know, the ideas of a republic and things like that, which gives a little bit of value towards women. And then with the cult of domesticity, you're going to see this replaced and become more of a the women give birth and they have the children, and then they stay at home with the children, and then the man goes out and works, and that sort of thing. I don't know what the AP questions are going to be, but there's a decent continuity and change argument you can look at. I would encourage you to look thematically back throughout this, even after you are done with me reviewing and doing the content. Look back thematically. Can we trace things like isolationism or imperialism through time? Or in this case, what's the role of women? Because we see, like I mentioned really, really early, as men are dying and the death rates or the age that you die at is really low, women have more of a place in society. And then when that goes away, well, then they're back. And that's Republican motherhood. Well, they still have something. And now it's cult of domesticity. And we'll see that change. But I mean, the 1950s, that's the cult of domesticity. The woman stays home, the husband goes to work. So, I mean, America plays around with this, and we're still trying to figure out how really to make sure everyone's equal in America today. So that's an interesting thing to look at. There's also an increase in urbanization because people are drawn to the factories. And you're also going to see an increase in nativism. It's going to be interesting to see the nativism as immigration starts increasing, especially leading up to the Civil War. This may surprise you, but America does not have a great history with immigration. You can look at today for that, and you can look as far back as like, well, I mean, we came into America and stole it from the Native Americans. Yeah, we have a bad history with immigration. And we'll mention this again here with the Texas Rebellion and things like that. So you see this nativism increase, and it's people like, no, you need to be native born American, but not Native American. You got to be white, but natively born in America. And they're worried about like the Catholics coming over and the Pope running this conspiracy. And they're worried about all the drunk Germans and Irish, and they're going to run away with our ballot box and things like that. The Know Nothing Party will be significant of that. Real quick, the corrupt bargain. So the ending of the era of good feelings is really going to come about with John Quincy Adams' presidency. So John Quincy Adams runs with three other people. And really the ones we care about are John Quincy Adams, Andrew Jackson, and Henry Clay. And no one wins. Like, no one has a majority of the electoral votes. I do want to point out, though, that Andrew Jackson won a plurality of both. He got more popular votes than anyone, and he got more electoral votes than anyone, but not a majority. So that means the House of Representatives has to decide this election. And I do want to point out Henry Clay is the Speaker of the House. So Henry Clay comes in fourth, so he doesn't advance. So he's part of the he's the Speaker of the House, who's part of the House. So the corrupt bargain is something that Jackson pushes, because essentially what happens is the House votes and they vote John Quincy Adams. And 2 days later, Henry Clay is made Secretary of State. And that's a substantial thing, because if you look back, almost all of the previous presidents, except for obviously George Washington and then John Adams, they were all Secretary of State. Like, that was what you did to become president later. And so that's going to be very, very important. And so Jackson goes, wait a minute, this isn't fair. I should have won. I had more of those votes. This is a corrupt bargain. John Quincy Adams said, I'll make you Secretary of State, Henry Clay, if you make me the president. There's some argument for that. I would also point out that Henry Clay also doesn't like Jackson and thinks he isn't qualified to be president. So there you go. But people don't like this. This is the original hashtag not my president. And John Quincy Adams doesn't really accomplish anything, because it's kind of terrible if you support him, because people don't really want him. So in the next election, that's when Andrew Jackson wins. And Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson from the $20 bill, I'm assuming. He is going to win this election also because, the last election, people were like, oh, like, John Quincy Adams cheated. So there's that. But also, you're going to see it because the states start eliminating property ownership as the requirement to vote. And so these poor people are now voting, and they're like, Jackson, he's a common man. Yeah, let's vote for him. A lot of parallels can be made between this election and the 2016 election. Jackson is not really a common man. Like, he comes from those roots, but he's not. Like, he's a general. He's running for president. Fundamentally, common men aren't running and winning the presidency. Like, you just won't. I mean, take any of the candidates running for president now who have like a serious shot. We'll look at the Democratic Party of getting the nomination, and they're not nobodies. Like, they're not just a regular old person. But he runs as this. Oh, vote for me. I'm one of you. And that's how Donald Trump runs in 2016. He goes, oh, I'm an outsider. I say things the way people want them to be said. Like, I'm not playing by your rules. And he's not a common man. Like, he's an elite. And he has been his entire life. But that's what the electorate responded to. Same thing happens here with Jackson. He does institute the spoils system. And I mean, you can talk about how much of that's still present today. The spoils system, he's going to be an advocate for it because he's like, oh, it's rinsing out democracy, essentially. So we're making sure that there's always this gradual change so you don't have people who become entrenched. Problem with that, though, is what if you bring in people who are bad at the job? Like, that's a problem. And so we're going to see eventually in the Gilded Age this kind of be taken away a bit. And you'll start having introduced like tests, merit tests, so that you actually have to be qualified for these jobs. There's the Indian Removal Act. So Andrew Jackson. So let me rewind a second. So we were talking about how slavery is expanding and Western movement is happening. There's some land in Georgia we really want. We can make some nice plantations. Also, there's gold there. And the only problem is the Cherokee are there. And so for Georgia, the solution is kick the Cherokee out. And this is a fairly more complicated process than I'm going to make it be. I'm just going to jump past it for the sake of time. But basically, you end up going to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court says, and this is the Marshall Court, no, states don't have the power to restrict these rights of the people. They said, oh, the Cherokee are a sovereign nation, so no, states can't do this. And Andrew Jackson's response is, cool, I really don't care. I'm going to do what I want anyway. And his quote is, I'm paraphrasing it, but Chief Justice Marshall has made his decision. Now let him enforce it. And so you're still going to have the Indian Removal Act. You're going to have the Trail of Tears, and the Native Americans are going to be forcibly removed. So that's Worcester v. Georgia, but you also have Cherokee Nation v. Georgia happening at this same time as well. So I always use Worcester v. Georgia. So there's that one. Anyway, then you have the Nullification Crisis, because really Jackson's presidency has three key crises. You have Indian removal, nullification, and the Bank of the United States, or the Bank Wars. So the Nullification Crisis is when there's a tariff. The tariff is a tariff of abominations. So a tariff, again, for those of you that are playing along at home, they're taxes on imported goods, and the idea is that they make foreign goods more expensive, which means people will buy American goods. This is a way that the government can work to incentivize you to buy from American companies. And, you know, if you're an American company, cool, you like that. If you're the South, you don't, because other countries will respond to your tariffs with tariffs. And then if, I don't know, let's say you're selling cotton to the world, then all of a sudden that's going to become more expensive and people will buy less of it and actively find it from other places. So the South doesn't like this. So you have the Tariff of Abomination pass, and obviously, you know, by the name, the South does not like it. And the Vice President, John C. Calhoun, is from South Carolina, very impressive cheekbones. He's definitely worth a Google. He says, no, we're not going to do this. States' rights. We should nullify this, which harkens back to the Alien and Sedition Act and the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, which is the idea of, hey, if the federal government passes something that hurts me as a state, I should be able to say no. And that's what he argues. Jackson doesn't like tariffs. Tariffs don't support the common man. They're not something that he supports. But he's going to be hypocritical as well, just like Jefferson was, because it's what works best for him. And so he's going to go, you know what? No, you have to follow what the federal government says. And he wants to pass the force bill, which is literally, we're just going to force you to do it. things look really bad. And then whoop, Henry Clay swoops in. He's the great compromiser. He's going to solve this. And he says, all right, guys, what about a lower tariff? And everyone goes, okay, all right. And then we move on and pretend like this didn't happen. This again is another compromise where we're like, oh, let's not fix the real problems. Let's just treat the symptoms and move on. So my gross example I always use is you have a cut on your foot and it gets infected and it hurts you. And so you just keep taking painkillers because you're like, oh, that makes the pain go away. But you don't actually treat the foot. And then eventually your foot needs to be cut off. The Civil War, like the states' rights argument of nullification is going to pop up again in the Civil War. And we never address it in any of these other times. And so we have to end up addressing it by literally fighting and killing each other. Last thing for Jackson, the Bank of the United States. He does not like the recharter attempt. He vetoes it, and he's going to break the money out of the Federal Bank of the United States and send it along to pet banks, so different state banks. And we're not going to go into the whole macroeconomics of why Federal Reserves and federal banks are important and whatnot. Suffice it to say, it helps to regulate the economy, and America is going to go into some panics after this, arguably because of this, or at least in a large part because of this. So that's Jackson. Want to do a quick political party update, and I'll include that right here, and I'll hold it here for a second so you guys can see. So the political parties are the Democrats. Now that you have Jackson, excuse me, you have the Democrats, and then you have the Whig Party. The Whigs are in response to Jackson. It's really just the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. I mean, it's kind of legitimately what it is. I'm really going to run into that. Reform movements, we're not going to spend a whole ton of time on this, but you are seeing people start trying to fix society. You're going to have the Second Great Awakening where people are going to go, oh, God wants me to fix myself and then go help other people. And so that'll be a big part in these other social reforms. You also get some really weird, this is recorded, so I'm not going to say, but you got some interesting things that happen here. Go look up the Serial Kings and where graham crackers come from and things like that. And you'll kind of get a sense of maybe people went a little overboard with these reforms. You also have utopian movements. They're not successful because we are not perfect as people. However, you have those happen, people going out, literally leaving society to go establish this perfect world where they're going to fix all of the problems and then show the world how it works. And they also do weird sex stuff as well in some of them. So those don't really work. Transcendentalism. History teachers like to call it 1800s hippies, the type of mentality. Take away the drugs. This is isolation as well, but it's individuals out. Henry David Thoreau, Ralph Waldo Emerson, things like that, Walt Whitman, all going out and trying to find the truth and find life. And they're spiritual, but not religious. And so, the same life that's in me is in the blade of grass and in the winds and the trees and all of that. Basically, they go out in the woods and write books about it. And then we still read those books today. And then the big one is abolition. You have some women's rights movements that aren't really successful. You see temperance to try and get men to stop consuming alcohol. That'll be a little bit more successful. You'll see alcohol rates drop off. Of course, you won't have prohibition until later, but you see that. But the big one will be abolition. Something important to keep in mind is I always talk about it on a spectrum, and I liken it to take like the Black Lives Matter movement today. There's a spectrum on there. In general, abolitionists believe in the same things or maybe have the same goal, but it varies differently in what are the methods going to be? How are we going to accomplish it? Who should be doing the action? When should it happen? All of those things. So keep those in mind. I'll name drop a few. David Walker, who says literally, let's have slaves and Black people rise up and kill these white masters because they've been holding us down for so long. That's more controversial. You have the Grimke Sisters, who are from a Southern perspective. Their family owned slaves. They go and they say, they go up into the North and they're like, hey, no, slavery is bad, which we kind of all take for granted because we know history. But for the most part, people then didn't know that. And the South was like, oh no, everything's fine. And they're like, okay, all right, cool. And here they're like, actually, no, seriously, things are bad. Excuse me. Then you have William Lloyd Garrison, Frederick Douglass, who are going to be more Northern focused. They'll be editors of newspapers and abolitionist magazines and things like that. And that gets us into Unit 4, War. Actually, this is going to be Manifest Destiny, Westward Expansion, the lead up to the Civil War, the actual Civil War and Reconstruction, and also kind of a little bit of Jim Crow law. So it's technically a lot. I'm going to jump into Manifest Destiny. So these are kind of the main parts of Manifest Destiny. Manifest Destiny is the idea that God has given all of the land in the West to us because we're Americans. The key to this is justification. Like, the land out there is owned by other people. It is not owned by us. And we're justifying our taking it because, like, it's other people. And so this justification is, no, we're destined to end up with this land. This is ours. God has given it to us because we are better. And so again, those of you who are in the review yesterday, we talked a lot about this connected with imperialism in the turn of the century, and about how you're going to see some of these similar ideas. How do we justify doing this? Because it's not morally right. Like, taking land from other countries by war is something generally frowned upon. And so it's, how are we going to justify this? You have the Texas Rebellion. I'll run through that quickly, and I mean quickly. So in 1821, Mexico gets their independence from Spain, and they make a deadly mistake of inviting Americans in. And so they sell land to Americans in California and in Texas, and Americans come in, and those are Texans or Anglos. They promptly don't follow the laws. They don't convert to Catholicism. They don't follow those social standings. And they also bring in their slaves, which is illegal. You can't have slaves. And Mexico's like, you can't do that. Like, I mean, that's bad. And so they start arresting them. So Santa Anna, who's the president of Mexico, arrests Stephen F. Austin, one of the wealthiest Anglos. And then the Texans get all in their feelings. I'm like, oh my God, like, we're being repressed, and that's a problem. We need a voice for freedom. And then they'll try and declare independence, and they'll lead this revolution. Yada, yada, Battle of the Alamo, San Jacinto, whatever. Texas wins. Texas becomes its own country. Texas is very proud that they were their own country. I would like to point out, basically, as soon as they become a country, they go to America and they're like, will you please make us a state? And America says no. And that kind of clashes with Manifest Destiny, but America says no because Texas would be a slave state. And that throws off our balance, and we don't know what to do. So there's that. So we'll pause on Texas. There are trails. Oregon Trail, Santa Fe Trail, Mormon Trail, significant for moving out there. The Ballad of Buster Scruggs on Netflix does a pretty decent job of showing the Oregon Trail for the last story, so you can kind of look at that. We're going to see the beginnings of the gold rush, so 49, people flooding out to California. And you're also going to have, well, I guess let's bring Texas in first before we fight the Mexican-American War. James K. Polk makes Texas a state, and to fix this, and what I mean by fix is to make sure we don't throw off our balance, we are going to make an agreement with Britain about how we are going to settle or close off the Oregon Territory. And we have our bold claim, 54-40 a fight. We will take all of the land. And Britain responds by saying, will you take just half? And we go, yeah, sure. Take half. And that becomes our free state. When Texas comes in and is added to America, there's border issues between them and Mexico. And Polk wants all that land. And so Polk sends the army out into that land and prompts a war with Mexico. And this is where you get into the dynamic of not everyone in America supported this war. Like, this war was started when we sent people into another country, and then, like, they got shot. And we were like, oh my God, we've been attacked. And James K. Polk goes back to America and he's like, hey, Americans have died in American territory. And a lot of people call him out on this. And I'm like, was it though? Like, was it in American territory? Shout out to a guy, you may know him, Abraham Lincoln. He's a representative from Illinois at the time. And he says, it's the spot resolution. He goes, hey, I want to know the spot where these people died. Where was it? Because sure, if it's in American territory, absolutely, we've been attacked. But, and he goes, I have a sneaking suspicion it's in this disputed territory, and that's not American territory. So no, we shouldn't fight that. And America fights the war, and we win it pretty convincingly, pretty quickly. But we enter into this problem, right? How do we look at this? Think of it like from a PR perspective. We attacked a country to steal their land from them because before this we offered to buy it and they said no. So, yeah, it looks really bad, and so what we do is we force them to sign the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which has us buying the Mexican cession territory from them. So we get to go, we bought this land, and in reality, no, we didn't. We kind of fought a war and took it. California is going to become free during this time period and then quickly get well, they're going to end up being brought in as a state, obviously, and we'll talk about that in 1850. But that's also going on at this time. This chunk of land is called the Mexican Cession Territory, which is the victor writes the history, because cession means like it's from cede, to give up. And so we literally called the land that we fought a war with Mexico with and bought from them, we call it the land Mexico gave up. And like that's still its name. So interesting little point there. So California is like, hello, hi, we'd like to be a state. We want to be a free state. And this enters in the Compromise of 1850, and there's the different parts on it. This will be the thing that eventually ends up killing Henry Clay. He's going to die. I want to show you this cartoon here, though, real quick. So I'll try and get this closer. But you can see him kind of torn up here because you have the line, and this is that 3630 line dividing north and south. And as we keep adding these puzzle pieces, what do we do? Where does the line go? What does it include? And so we thought we'd solve these problems, and we really didn't. So the 5 parts of it are: Texas gets $10 million to settle boundary disputes between them and New Mexico. No one cares about that. You're going to see a stronger Fugitive Slave Act, so a stronger fugitive slave law, which really angers the North. And for all of like the historians who talk states' rights in the South and that sort of thing, but leading up to the Civil War, they're not the only ones saying that. The Fugitive Slave Act is a law that is passed by the federal government, and it kind of gets rid of slavery, or makes slavery spread into the North. So there are like whole systems set up where it's a kind of rigged. So judges get paid more money to be found or to find in favor of slave catchers than the defendants, aka these people accused of being runaway slaves. And there's no real like proof that's needed besides this judge deciding. So it's not a fair fight or an even fight. And you see a lot of kidnapping happening and these removals of people who weren't actually runaway slaves. And the North goes, wait a minute, we said we wanted to be free states. Now we're not free states. The federal government's trying to take that away. States' rights. We should be listened to, and we should be able to nullify those laws. And so that's something important to keep in mind. We always look at the South as, oh, states' rights. Yeah. Well, the North is doing it during this time as well. Excuse me. We're going to introduce a concept called popular sovereignty. Instead of Congress having to be the bad guys and have to make the decisions on whether or not we'll be slave or free, they go, no, let the people decide. So we decide that for Utah, New Mexico. That's going to pose some problems later. California will come as a free state, and there'll be no slave trade in D.C. And this kind of brings us into the causes of the Civil War. So westward expansion, absolutely a big one. Slavery, absolutely a big one. A lot of like the whole core of this is going to be about slavery. We're also going to talk about, how that manifests itself, because the idea of states' rights is being manifested over the concept of slavery. So you can both say, yes, states' rights was a cause of the Civil War, but the cause was based upon slavery. Yeah, westward expansion is a cause of the Civil War because it's based on how do we make states slave or free. So you still have that slavery as the key component there. Excuse me. Cause of the Civil War. I don't remember if I held this up for you, but here you go. Some of those causes, I'm just going to run down them like this. They're roughly timelining. Harriet Beecher Stowe, who writes Uncle Tom's Cabin. She gets the nickname Little Lady Who Started This Big War by Lincoln himself. This is similar to the Grimke Sisters, who their method of abolition is read the books about it, pass them along, talk about it. She writes a book and it's fiction, but it talks about like that slavery is bad and it shows the problems. And again, we take this all for granted, but people are like, oh, shoot, like maybe this actually is a problem. And that's really important. And so this is going to bolster the abolition movement because people now have this thing to lean back on. Oh, wait a minute, look, that was bad. Excuse me. Popular sovereignty will rear its ugly head with the Kansas-Nebraska Act. So Kansas-Nebraska Act, excuse me, pushed by Stephen Douglas, is going to be popular sovereignty. So Kansas wants to come in. It's right next to Missouri. They're like, all right, let's do it. The problem is basically you have two factions. So you have people in Kansas, absolutely, they can vote. But you have border ruffians coming over from Missouri who want it to be a slave state. And then you have free soilers who are coming from Illinois who want to make it a, I may have switched that. Missouri's the slave state. Illinois is the free state. I don't remember what I said, but slave from Missouri, free from Illinois. And you have the election, and there's like 2 times the number of votes cast than people could vote, and it comes out like slave, and then they're like, yeah, and then the other side's like, no, it's a fake election, it shouldn't count. And there are literally 2 constitutions and 2 Kansases, at the time, one free and one slave. And this leads to what is called Bleeding Kansas, where everyone's just like killing each other in there. There's the caning of Sumner. This is a moment in the Senate where Charles Sumner is beaten with a cane because of his speech, "A Crime Against Kansas." If you want to classify the Civil War as Americans fighting and killing Americans over slavery, that's the Kansas-Nebraska or Bleeding Kansas. Like, it's Americans fighting Americans over slavery, and they're killing each other. And you see that happening in the Senate as well. So what I want to point out is that this is festering, like this is bubbling to the surface. These things are escalating with time, and we're not just seeing these conversations that then make a compromise and we move on. We're seeing actual violence, both with people and our politicians. You have the Dred Scott versus Sanford case. Dred Scott sues for his freedom because now he lives in a free state. And this is a sweeping statement by the Supreme Court, who a lot of them own slaves. And they basically are like, slavery is legal everywhere because slaves are property. The government can't take property away. Also, Missouri Compromise is unconstitutional. And just like, boom. Also, it takes away citizenship for African Americans, regardless of free or slave. So we're going to deal with that after the Civil War. So hold on to that for a second. But it gets rid of all free states. So if you bring slaves into Massachusetts, a bastion of freedom, you can do that. They're not a free state because the government can't regulate property, and so this is states' rights now. Now you have people in the North go, whoa, we're being attacked about this. We don't want that. You get the Lincoln Douglas debates. Where Lincoln and Douglas are going around Illinois debating. Lincoln does not win the Senate election, but he will obviously go on to be the president in a couple of years. So if you ever find yourself in a bad situation and you've lost something and you feel like a failure, just remember, in 2 years, you too can be president of the United States. John Brown's raid on Harpers Ferry. This is another manifestation of the violence over slavery. John Brown goes down into Harper's Ferry to steal a bunch of guns and give them to slaves and have them start killing people. And it doesn't really work like that. He gets captured. He's killed. The North goes, oh my God, you've killed him. He was just trying to bring freedom. How dare you? And the South was like, you literally just attacked us, which, yeah, fair. And so we're seeing the tension, and then the violence. And really the culminating factor will be the election of 1860. Lincoln's elected, and it just all falls apart from there. So what happens in the early years, so right after the election, the lower South secedes. South Carolina's like, nope, we're out. They're like, we're done. And I use this. So they went through and they took the documents that these states said, wrote for why they were leaving, and they kind of calculated it out in percentages. And the question is, all right, why'd they leave? And Lincoln's election makes up a very, 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 very small part of each of these. The thing that makes up the biggest part, so in Georgia, 56% slavery. Mississippi, 73% slavery. Texas, 54% slavery. South Carolina, actually 20% slavery. 37 was about states' rights, and then context made up the other 41%. But South Carolina, again, had that nullification issue. So you do see states' rights pop up, but it's about slavery. They're worried about keeping slavery, and they're afraid that Lincoln will become president. And the bigger thing that we kind of gloss over and don't look at in this is the fact that Lincoln's not really on the ballot in the South. So, like, if you tell someone, oh, you don't like that decision, vote for someone else. The South's like, we did. We voted for someone else, and the North carried the entire election. And that's not fair. That's not right. What are we going to do? And I'll point out most of those Southerners, or let me rephrase that. Most of the presidents coming up before this were Southerners. They had background in slavery, things like that. They're appointing people to the Supreme Court, like we see in Dred Scott versus Sanford, who owned slaves. And the South, slave states, they're holding a lot of federal power. And now they look and they go, oh, the North can pick the president, and we can't do anything about it. And that means they're going to take over the Supreme Court. We can't do anything about it. And yeah, they feel violated, attacked, like they're going to lose their freedom. And so, especially that freedom to have slaves, and they lash out. The Upper South will not secede until after the Battle of Fort Sumter. And then shout out to North Carolina. North Carolina is going to be the last state to secede. They're kind of stuck between Virginia and South Carolina and don't really have a choice. Interesting little history. Kind of look at the different counties throughout North Carolina and their percentage that own slaves. And you'll notice that there was some serious division between whether or not we should secede or not. For the Civil War, there's that. I'm just going to run through that real quick. The strategies, it's the Anaconda Plan, this little picture down here. The idea being we as the North or the Union, we're going to surround the South with a blockade. We're going to take the Mississippi River, and then we're going to press down and try and take Richmond, which is the capital of the Confederate States of America. Something important I want to note at this time period, Lincoln does not view this as a legitimate faction. So what I mean by that is he doesn't recognize the Confederates as another country. He does not recognize their legitimacy to leave America. And so it's always a rebellion or an insurrection or something like that. So he plays a lot of the war using those types of terms because he refuses to give credence to it being a legitimate movement. The North kind of sucks in the beginning. It's just not great. The South has better generals. Over time, you're going to see the industrial power of the North really bearing weight as the South starts running low on people and supplies and things of that nature. Lincoln, very famously at the beginning of the war, he goes, the reason for this war is to preserve the Union. We need to bring them back. And he has a very famous quote where he says, in order to preserve the Union, if that means freeing all the slaves, I'll do it. Freeing none of the slaves, I'll do it. Or by freeing some and not freeing others, I'll do that as well. He doesn't make it the core of the war. He makes it about this constitutional issue. You can't leave. And then Antietam happens. Antietam is the bloodiest single day. And people in the North start going, wait a minute, hold on. I don't care. We're dying. Let them leave. Who cares about a constitutional issue that doesn't matter to me? And Lincoln needs to recontextualize and reframe the war. And so he makes it about freeing the slaves. You'll see the Emancipation Proclamation, which is kind of a middle ground, because especially towards the end with the 13th Amendment, and shout out to the movie Lincoln, which I think is still on Netflix. Good movie. I recommend it. It shows his push for we really need to get freedom. The Emancipation Proclamation is that middle ground. He offers it as a threat up early, like the middle of 62. And he says, hey, January 1st, 63, this is what's going to happen. I'm going to take away your slaves if you are in rebellion. So he does this for two reasons. One, he's trying to threaten the South into coming back. And two, he's keeping slaves in the border states so they stay with the North and don't leave. This doesn't free the slaves. Like, that's a popular thing you probably learned throughout elementary school. It doesn't. What it does is free them. So like the day of that, if you were a slave in North Carolina, you weren't like going up to your master on January 1st, 63 and like, what's up? I'm out. We're done. He would go, no, like Jefferson Davis is our president. I don't know who I don't know who Lincoln is. He doesn't have any bearing on me. And so you're just not going to see that happen, even though we like to think that's what it is. It'll be the 13th Amendment that'll end slavery everywhere and not just in those areas in rebellion. So if you were a slave in the South, the only way you're getting freedom is when the North comes down and literally frees you. Like, that's the only way it's happening. Battle of Vicksburg, Gettysburg, turning point in the war. Gettysburg is about shoes. Look it up. Cool. Shout out to the Battle of Bentonville. I used to work there. Johnson County. You should go. And then Appomattox Courthouse is kind of viewed as the ending of the war. And I mean, technically the ending of the war is Bennett Place, which is near Durham. Shout out to North Carolina. That's the true ending. But Appomattox Courthouse is when the South kind of loses Lee's army. And that's officially kind of like the end of the war. And that brings us into Reconstruction. So we have Lincoln's plan for Reconstruction, and he's doing this as the war is winding down. Oh, real quick, I guess back some social stuff for the Civil War. Don't forget, like, not everyone supported this. You have people there are soldiers from every single Southern state who are represented in the Northern Army. You have people in the South who don't want to support the Confederates and are hung for it. That happens in North Carolina. So you have that. And then in the North, Lincoln's going to suspend the writ of habeas corpus. He's going to move to shut down telegraph offices. And there are literally riots over the draft. Like, people are upset about this. The movie Gangs of New York and all of its 90 hours of screen time kind of dives into this issue as well. So that's some social stuff. So Lincoln's plan for Reconstruction is to be lenient on the South to bring them back and kind of end this quickly. He doesn't want it to turn into like, ha, you're wrong, we won, like, pay us the pound of flesh and whatnot. He's not out looking for revenge. He's looking for change. And then this happens. He is very famously shot in the head, and Lincoln dies. Okay, that's John Wilkes Booth. I don't have time to do my whole killing Lincoln story. It's a great story. So if you had me for APUSH, you heard it. If not, I don't know, come see me sometime. It's a blast. Anyway, Reconstruction is going to be focused on kind of two ends. Well, I guess you could argue three goals. One, we need to physically bring the South back. Two, we need to change the South. Like, we're freeing the slaves. That happens with the 13th Amendment. And, you know, we need to protect their rights, things like that. And then we need to physically rebuild the South. Different groups of people have different thoughts on this. Radical Republicans are going to go, absolutely, physically change the South, make that social system different, protect African Americans, equality. And the presidents, for the most part, during this time period, go, nope, we don't want to do that. And so you'll see this clash between the presidents and Congress. You are going to have I'm going far on my slide here. You're going to have the three Reconstruction Amendments. 13th Amendment is going to free the slaves. The 14th Amendment is going to give citizenship. And then 15th is going to give the right to vote to all males. Women still can't vote, not until 1920. Shout out to the 99 years in the nation where women have been able to vote. It has not even been 100 years. Anyway, this is for the president. And yes, some state, we'll get into it. Anyway, I'm just going to jump into how this changes the South. You can kind of look up some of the different Reconstruction plot points and things like that, like the Freedmen's Bureau and things like that. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this. So this new South, different from the old South, there are changes. The South does not take the Civil War well, like the Reconstruction well. Like, they're not like, oh, darn it, guys, you beat us fair and square. We're done. We're going to change our ways. The North comes down and they try and change this. So here's this. There'll be some carpetbaggers and scalawags who are coming down. And the carpetbaggers are the ones coming down. Scalawags are white people who are going to vote for Republicans. And, you know, we'll say violating the South. I mean, the example I'll use for carpetbaggers, because a lot of them come down and run for office, and that irritates people in the South. And there's also people who make a pretty good amount of money from, I'm not going to call it flipping properties, but that would be the equivalent we have today. But they go in and the example is always this. So in the Great Recession, all right, 2007, you're living in a neighborhood, you start watching other people in the neighborhood lose their jobs, and they start having their houses foreclosed upon, and those start being, you know, bought by the banks. And then all of a sudden, some really rich person just like swoops through the neighborhood, buys up all the properties because the prices are super low. Like, you're not looking at that person like, that's a smart financial move there. I see what you're doing. You're like, you're preying upon these people like they suffered and you're going to make money off of it. That's despicable. That's what people are saying about carpetbaggers. You know, well, this is disgusting. How could you? You're preying on us. And response for the carpetbaggers would be like, I'm just trying to make money, man. So That's significant. I also want to talk about these restrictions that will be placed on African Americans because the South doesn't just accept this. So the 13th Amendment happens, boom, the South goes for black codes. How can we find ways to punish African Americans differently under the law than white people? And you can do that because Dred Scott got rid of the concept of citizenship for African Americans. The documentary on Netflix, The 13th, is it's a good watch. So it touches on this idea and how prisons are created as ways to, because in the 13th Amendment, it says you can still have slavery in cases of prisons as punishment for a crime. And so you will start to see a wave of the South punishing African Americans for crimes so that they can then put them in prison and make them work. So that's definitely worth a watch, and that'll have some connections, obviously, up even into modern times. And as you get into more of the Unit 8 and 9 law and order type presidents and things of that nature, and mass incarceration and stuff. So we'll wait a little bit on that, but I do recommend it. Excuse me. The response to that from the North is citizenship. So the 14th Amendment grants citizenship. And then what you're going to see is you're going to start seeing segregation. And this will be Jim Crow segregation. We are going to treat you equally. Everyone will have the same things, just separately. And I mean, it's not equal. I mean, fundamentally, they're not equal. I don't have a picture on here, but I'm sure you, I mean, if you've ever seen a picture of the water fountains, right, that are segregated, you can know, oh, the white one is nicer than the black one. Like it's not really equal. Look at that with schools as well. And there's going to be massive voting restrictions after the 15th Amendment. Because when the 15th Amendment happens, you see African-American participation in the government skyrocket. It booms, it takes off because they can vote. They're voting in Republicans, they're voting in black people, and you're going to see this happen. And that's bad for the South. And so the South finds ways to restrict that. Literacy tests, poll taxes, grandfather clauses, all of these things. The Klan will rise up during this time period, and they'll pop up a couple other times as well. And it's all about intimidation and restricting the lives of African Americans to try and make it more back to the social structure of slavery, where you had white people in a superior position to African Americans. And that's kind of what the South wants. And with Jim Crow laws, that's going to happen. Definitely up until Brown versus Board of Education and the modern civil rights movement. But in a lot of cases, even further beyond that. I mean, we're still having this conversation as Americans today about, is there true equality and how do we fix this? So by no means did, the 13th Amendment, we ended slavery. It's over. Because when these slaves are freed, they don't have anything. They have no money. They have no income. They've only been trained or educated on whatever it was they were doing. They don't have an education. They don't really have anywhere to go. And also the society around them hates them and tries to treat them differently. And there's a promise, we're going to give every freedman 40 acres and a mule. That does not happen. And what happens is you get sharecropping. Sharecropping is slavery 2.0. So you just have a lot of the same people who were freed now working on their master's old land and not making any money from it. So that's not freedom. And this is all going to feed into the eventual Jim Crow South as we know it. There's the Compromise of 1877. That election is also a tie. And the Republicans get the presidency, and in return, they remove their military from the South, and that ends Reconstruction. And from that point on, 1877 and onward, the South gets to control things. Real quick, the Jim Crow South, you should know de jure and de facto segregation. De jure segregation is by law. De facto segregation is going to be segregation that's, we'll say, naturally occurring, or it just happens. There aren't any requirements from the government that it happens. I talk about the difference between racism, prejudice, and discrimination. Lynching is a scourge throughout the South, and look, you guys, if you went through this, I'm assuming, at least read some part of Blood Done Sign My Name. So it's 1970, North Carolina, African-American male who was a veteran, is shot in the head in broad daylight by a white family because he made some sort of pass, maybe kind of to one of the women there. And they're found not guilty on trial. People saw it, they know what happened, but they're found not guilty. So, there's that. That's pretty substantial. And so that'll do it for me. I'll hold on for a second if you guys want to pop in any questions. And then if not, we'll just kind of roll out. If you want to type in some of those questions as I'm saying this, we'll do another thing. I want to say tentatively on Tuesday. We're going to do another writing review. I don't think I have a meeting, and then we'll do this again Wednesday as well. Any other questions? I'm going to say that as no questions. Awesome. Appreciate you guys all. Have a great day.